Spectre Divide is a brand new tactical shooter game that was launched by the massive streamer named Shroud, who has over 11 million followers on Twitch and is overall just known as one of the best competitors in esports. So when he announced that he was teaming up with Mountaintop Studios to release his own game, well, you can just imagine how hyped people were, because Spectre Divide wasn't looking to be just another tactical shooter game. It was coming in with a pretty unique duality mechanic to make it stand out from all the other games like Valorant and CSGO. But the reality of the situation though is that Spectre Divide hasn't been doing too hot recently. Ever since it launched in early access, it's been struggling to break into the tactical FPS market with a couple of matchmaking issues, questionable monetization practices. Some of the gameplay mechanics just seem like straight knockoffs from Valorant, so it's been having a rough time recently. The decline has been so fast that it's just got people asking themselves, why isn't the game doing any better? You know, because it is tied to such a massive name like Shroud's. So let's talk about what exactly went wrong with Spectre Divide, what the developers are doing to sort of like damage control the situation, and if the game has a chance to survive over the long run. And just in case you've never heard of Spectre Divide before, it's a 3v3 class-based tactical shooter game that came out in September of 2024. The game follows the standard Valorant CSGO formula, where you have attackers and defenders each round, where the attackers have to plant and detonate a bomb, and while the defenders just have to defend the points and defuse the bomb. The thing that's supposed to make Spectre Divide so unique here is that the game has the duality system that lets you control two characters in a match and alternate between them. So even though the game is a 3v3, it's more like you're playing a 6v6 with 3 people. So you always just gotta be aware of where you're leaving your second body while you're playing with the first. You can throw a little puck that moves your second body to wherever you want it to, which is supposed to be super helpful for flanking enemies and crossing certain obstacles, but you know, for the most part, I just left mine at the spawn point and I just used it like a second life basically. It kind of just reminds me of how the portal system works in Splitgate, you know, the game that's basically just Halo with portals, where at first you kind of just use the portals to move around and do basic flanking, but the more and more you improve at the game and the better you get at using certain setups, that's where the high skill ceiling really comes into play. But the duality system is supposed to be the main selling point for Spectre Divide, because the weapon picks, the class abilities, the map designs, all of it is just balanced around that one mechanic. And while the whole duality thing does seem like an interesting concept on the surface level, well, when I was playing Spectre Divide, I was actually just constantly asking myself if they really did need to make an entire game revolve around this one ability that I personally don't think it's really different or interesting enough to make it be the entire main focus of the game. Like, it almost feels like the duality mechanic is more of a gimmick that each character has instead of just being some sort of revolutionary feature. Like, the most common complaint that people have is that the game feels entirely like it was built off of Yoru from Valorant. So Yoru is a character from Valorant where he has a very similar ability that lets him throw a little ball forward that he can then teleport to. So it kind of gets that feeling that Spectre Divide is just a 3v3 Valorant game mode where everyone just picks Yoru and they have an extra life. So what was supposed to be a fresh take on the tactical shooter genre actually just ends up feeling like a downgraded experience of an already established game. So it feels like you're just asking yourself the question, is Spectre Divide really trying to make a name for itself and stand out against the top contenders in the tactical hero shooter genre? Or is it just a knockoff game that's specifically targeted towards Valorant fans, primarily Yoru users? Because there's a lot of similarities between the two games. It's not just the Yoru ability, it's not just the duality mechanic. Once you actually sit down and, you know, try out all the different sponsors, which are basically like the different classes in the game, you realize, you're like, oh, that's in Valorant. Oh, this is also in Valorant. So there's really just too many similarities for you to be like, oh, this is an entirely different experience. And it's like, imagine I decided to release a knockoff version of Apex Legends, except I gave every single character on the roster Wraith's ability to go invisible. Like, would that ability really be groundbreaking enough for the game to succeed? I don't really think so. And you know, maybe it's just the way that the duality system is implemented in Spectre Divide, but a single mechanic unfortunately just really isn't enough to carry an entire game. Like, it can get people into the door, don't get me wrong. You know, they're gonna check it out, they're gonna want to play it, and you know, they certainly did, because when you look at the Steam charts for Spectre Divide, they did get a respectable 30,000 max concurrent players on release. I'm assuming that a large chunk of those players were just coming in from Shroud being the one promoting the game. He does have a pretty big following, but the player base just wasn't given enough reasons to stick around, so the game has really been struggling with their numbers falling off pretty hard ever since release, and they've already had to deal with laying off a couple of employees too over at Mountaintop Studios. It's gotten so bad that the developers even had to come out with a blog post where they had to emphasize that even though the concurrent player base is going lower and lower, the game isn't really technically dead, and they're also not planning on shutting down the game servers anytime soon or stopping the updates, which I guess, you know, it is reassuring from the developers to hear that the game's not going anywhere. You know, it's nice to hear that they're actually aware and actively working on the game, but it has like a pretty negative underlying message because, you know, you've never had to hear Fortnite, Apex Legends, or Warzone have to to come out with a statement going like, hey guys, we're not dying, we're doing just fine. You know, it just sends the wrong message at the end of the day. But some of the solutions that they're proposing to do in order to fix the whole issue is that they're planning to combine the matchmaking queues and, you know, try to figure out a way to bring new players in. And, you know, in a perfect world, everything would just sort itself out. You know, people would fall back in love with the game and everything would be fine. But the reality of the situation with Spectre Divide is that it's already made its big impact. It's had its one big break. They've already had their free-to-play live service boom when it came out, and I don't really realistically see it ever reaching those numbers ever again. When they launched the game back in early access in September, unfortunately, Spectre Divide didn't make the best first impressions with the community because the game was suffering from major performance and server issues. The guns kind of all just felt too similar to be able to tell them apart. The maps really felt just way too big for it being a 3v3 game, so it really just slowed the game down to a crawl sometimes. Some of the top questions from their Q&A was people literally asking them, why didn't they delay the launch to improve everything that was wrong with the game? And why was there a lack of marketing when the game came out too? So in a market where first impressions can either make or break the future of your game, unfortunately Spectre Divide was already stuck with the buggy Valorant knockoff title, and even though Mountaintop Studios has been working hard on addressing all the game issues, and they've been very vocal and transparent with the community about what's coming next, well, the damage to the game's reputation, you know, it's already there, man. It's really hard to bounce back from that. The community on Reddit already has a pretty negative outlook on the game's future, talking about how Shroud didn't push the game enough, how he only played it for a week and then he dropped it, how the game's art style isn't really appealing, and everyone's already asking if the game's already dead. It also doesn't help their case when you see that the microtransactions in the game have also been getting their fair share of criticism as well. Like, I swear, everything about this game has been picked apart and criticized by the player base. Like, I don't think I've ever heard a single positive thing come out from people who actually play the game, other than the fact that they can get a few games in while they're being timed out in Valorant. But with the prices of some of the microtransactions being as high as $15 for a single skin, well, Reddit's been up in arms talking about how the price of the microtransactions in Spectre Divide don't really match up with the game's value. Like, I'm not saying that the more popular your game is, the more expensive your skins should be, but if your player base is in the gutters and you're struggling with the matchmaking queues, the last thing I want to do as a consumer is drop $15 on a skin that might not even be around a year from now. On Valorant, it sort of makes sense because, you know, in my opinion, those prices on like the tactical shooter genre, they're pretty high for microtransactions, you know? But at least I know that the game's worth the cosmetics, and I'm sure that a lot of people who play Spectre Divide on the regular kind of just feel the same way. So if I was Mountaintop in this situation, I know it sucks because it's literally, you know, you're playing with people's money here, but maybe reworking the pricing strategy can help the players feel more comfortable with wanting to spend more in the game. Like, I know Shroud didn't directly work on coding the game or anything like that, he was more of an advisor than anything else, but it kind of just sucks when you tie your name to something that you think has a lot of potential and promote it all over your social media, only for it to end up going downhill in the end. If there's one thing that people love to talk about Spectre Divide is that the game has potential, but it's not where it needs to be at the moment. So Spectre Divide is just a clear-cut example in this case of how building an entire game based around one ability, one concept, or like one gimmick can totally pop off if the idea is good enough and it can get people to try your game in the end. But if it's not something that translates well into the game's genre, then it probably won't be a big enough reasons for the players to want to stick around, you know, over the long term. And the duality mechanic does seem like an interesting idea on paper, but again, you know, while playing Spectre Divide, I was just feeling like I was in a game mode inside of Valorant where everybody's just using Yoru. Maybe if they can just find a way to rework it and make it more interesting, that could be enough to get people curious enough to want to give it a second shot again. And I know that Mountaintop Studios is working on improving the game as well, but with so many other great and already established titles in the genre just dominating completely, like, I personally think that Spectre Divide just didn't make a big enough impact during early access to kind of just have any sort of long-term staying power. So the future for the game isn't really looking bright, unfortunately. I would love to be proven wrong here, but, you know, we'll just have to wait and see. But that's all I really wanted to talk about with you guys today, so thank you guys for watching.